ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. I think you know my name by now. My name is John O'Sullivan, and I'm the president of the Danube Institute. And thank you for being here for what I think will be an extremely fascinating and entertaining afternoon. Now, I want to begin with a rather sad note, however, which is to say that my colleague, David Martin Jones, our research director, was one of the people who had the idea of a series on film noir and a discussion followed by each film being followed by a discussion program. And it was he who contacted Paul de Quenoy of the Palm Beach Institute, and he is responsible more than anyone else, with Paul, for this evening and for the previous and future evenings in which we discuss the serious but also entertaining aspects of movies, sometimes about, on this occasion, the film noir about crime and punishment and temptation and surrender and so on. We are going on to other topics as well in future. I think we're going to have at least two more of the evenings on film noir, but I think later we're going to have films about communism, one of which, for example, Ninotchka, is my favorite film, and it's a brilliant analysis of communism, and it's a very humane film, as well as having other qualities. But it was David who started this, and his early death, which was 2 weeks ago now, is a matter of great sorrow for all his colleagues, and it's only right, I think, that on this occasion we should acknowledge our debt to him for this particular program in our series, in the series of the whole idea of discussing seriously film. So I'd like to just make that point and say how sorry we are. May I now turn to the film itself. Laura, the topic today is Laura, Was She Really a Dream? Which I think is the slogan for the movie. And this is a film, I think, of great interest and fascination, beautifully done with some great acting. I think, obviously, the star of the film is really the female lead. But in many respects, she is challenged for the title of star by Clifton Webb, the actor who plays Waldo Lydecker, and whom you will find more and more interesting as the film proceeds. So Paul is somebody who has made a special study at the Palm Beach Freedom Institute of film noir. I therefore gladly introduce him and ask him to say some words, 7 or 8 minutes, before we see the movie. He will then come back and he will tell us more things about the movie than any of us knew, and more interesting aspects to it. At least that's what he did last time, and I'm confident he will do so again. Thank you very much. Paul, take over.
Thank you, John, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. This is our second film noir presentation. When the late and very much missed David Martin Jones and I conceived of this series, I was here to talk about something else, and we got a little boozy after dinner, and thought, what would have a film noir series? Great idea, David. And we had to decide which ones we should show. To me, there was really only one possible selection. If you know the history of film as a genre and of film noir particularly, you may know that during the Second World War, there were 5 highly influential film noirs made in the United States. We'll talk about the definitions of this in a moment. And that they were not able to be sent to Europe because of the conflict. You can't show them in Nazi-occupied Europe. They're American movies. There's no way to get them there. There's no distribution rights. It's a completely closed thing. So they all came at once in the summer of 1946, right after the war, organized as a film festival. And these 5 particular films proved to be enormously influential on what we call the new wave of French cinema, the Nouvelle Vague. The French directors of the late 40s, 1950s, and probably up until about the year of 1968, who were immensely important in their own country, and also, perhaps ironically, influential on the subsequent development of American film from 1968 onward. So really what you see if you say American directors, Hollywood directors are influenced by film noir, what they're influenced by, or Nouvelle Vague, what they're influenced by in reality is an interpolation of American films of the 1940s recast through French cinema later. The 5 films, we can name them, are of course Laura today from 1944. We started the series with the very first one, the chronologically first one that was developed in America during World War II. That would be the Maltese Falcon. That's probably the most familiar. Some of you I know were here for that. We also have, again in 1944, Double Indemnity, very important film, which I think we'll be doing probably next year. We also have The Woman in the Window, great picture. And finally, Murder in My Suite. Murder in My Suite is based on Raymond Chandler's crime novel, Farewell, My Lovely. So those 5 films are the ones we will be discussing. We did Maltese Falcon already. I'll repeat a little bit of what I said when I was here in November about the definition of film noir. Obviously, this is a French term. American directors working in this, what became recognized as a genre, would never have used that term at the time. It would have not made any sense in an American context. Even American film critics don't start using it until about the 1970s. So it's an anachronistic thing. The term comes from the French film critic world, the universe of film criticism in France, not exactly after the Second World War, but rather before. The first use of the term is seen in actually a reactionary newspaper, the Action Française, which is a French monarchist paper. In that time frame, we have ideas about the roman noir, or the black novel, the dark novel, which we would probably understand as the Gothic novel. The great example of that I can give you from English literature would be Bram Stoker's Dracula. So how do we get from that to these kind of very gritty films that we'll be dealing with, although Laura's a bit out of class in that way? What happens as culture and society develop in the early decades of the 20th century is that you have 2 very important themes, particularly with the development of film. One has to do with crime and criminals. We start to have gangster movies. We start to see unsolvable solutions to, violent solutions to unsolvable problems, impossible situations that we can only imagine ourselves being in. Then we move on and also in the direction of immense collapse of trust in public institutions, something we see again today, particularly in America and Europe, throughout the Western world. The statistics of Americans who have faith in media, higher education, the judicial system, Congress, they're absolutely appalling. They're really low. And again, if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, it's entirely correct to speak of a crisis of capitalism, to use the Marxist term, an idea that the existing institutions were quite inadequate to solve rising social problems. If you put those 2 strands of creativity together, you get a lot of very disappointed people who are going through things that they are not supposed to experience or express: greed and obsession, violence and anger, fierce tempers, aggression, anger, things that you are not supposed to show in polite society, but things that human beings naturally experience in their lives. Right? And out of this is born what the French critics of the 1930s even start to call a dark cinema. Right? A gritty understanding, not really of reality or truth, which becomes associated with French film later, but rather experience, or life as it is experienced. Right? We talk about this today. It's like not vérité in truth, but rather vécu, lived. You hear this term all the time now. my lived experience. What does that mean, really? People of the left use it to trump facts, essentially. They say, well, okay, you can give us an empirical understanding of state and society, but how I feel about it inside, my personal experience in life, is more important than your facts, your science, your history, your empiricism don't matter next to my ontology. Right? This is very much a strong argument. What it really means, I think in a more classical sense, would be your personal subjectivity. When we see characters in film noir, one of the things that's most attractive about the genre is that film noir characters have what millennials today call relatability. It's a terribly overused word. I cringe every time I hear it. I try not to use it myself. But the idea that you can identify with, experience their passions, their motivations, understand what's driving them, and see it on a screen leads to a degree of empathy where it comes out of the picture. And indeed, in the film noirs, especially these very good ones that we're going to be seeing in the series and in many others, you have characters who are lifelike, and in some cases more lifelike than people you might actually know. Actually living human beings come alive in lesser ways. The black and white medium in film, which endured up until the end of the 1950s, allowed for a great deal of that kind of expressive interest to come across in the medium of film. You'll notice in film noir that in order to compensate for the absence of color, the directors would rely heavily on shadow, on the contrast between darkness and light. The Italian term for this from the Renaissance is chiaroscuro, still used in film direction even today. You will see great billowing clouds of smoke, bizarre angles for particular shots, and the idea is that you are compensating for the inability of film up until rather late to show people in color. Now, we still do black and white films exceptionally today. One of the ones that I think is most important would be Schindler's List. And to get an idea of what I'm talking about, I'll bring up the film for this reason. When you watch Schindler's List in the very beginning, in the first scenes, when Oskar Schindler, played by Liam Neeson, is very opportunistic and amoral, he is always in the shadows, his visage is clouded by smoke, and as his moral purpose becomes clearer in the course of the film, when he realizes that there are horrors happening and that he can do something about it and starts doing something about it, that smoke goes away. The shadows go away. He's still in black and white, but he becomes clearer in image. And the only way you could do that is if you use black and white. There's no way to do that in a color film. Right? Film noir allows this to happen. And it adds a dimension of surreality to the subjectivities that you'll be seeing from the different characters. To talk about the genesis of Laura, who's seen it before? Raise your hand if you've, okay, so some of you have seen it. Most of you have not. I don't want to spoil the plot, and I'll come back after the film and say more about that. But I'll tell you approximately where it comes from. Laura was a novel written by an American author called Vera Caspary. Vera Caspary grew up in Chicago in a kind of lower middle class family, and for a person in such circumstances, a woman particularly, the best route to advancement was to get a certificate in stenography. You could be like a court stenographer and develop a career that you could use then to support yourself. She did that very well, but she got very bored with it because when you're a stenographer, what do? You're taking down other people's words. Often it's very boring. It's boring court testimony. She was actually offended by the bad quality of the English she was hearing from different witnesses. So she got very tired of this and branched out in other directions in her career as a writer. And one of the career paths she could take was to do copy editing for advertising firms. As you'll see in the film, the title character has that very job. Guess why, right? Because she's writing from her lived experience of what it is to be one of the actually very few women at that time working in advertising. This is the world of Mad Men, but if you watch the series, but maybe 10, 20 years before. All right? So Vera Caspary has that. She also starts to write fiction, and she was profitable enough in this to live off of her career as a writer. She's not regarded as a great writer in any sense, and Laura is very much a case where the movie is far more popular than the book because, frankly, it's not a very good book. If you read the novel Laura, it's disappointing compared to the film. And we can talk about the creative process of how it comes to the stage. I think that's probably the best way to proceed. She originally conceived it as a stage drama. And there were directors who wanted to produce it on Broadway, but none of the producers or financial backers who could make that happen were interested. She actually talked with the eventual director of the film, with Otto Preminger, about this. Preminger was an immigrant from Austria who had he had worked under Max Reinhardt in the theater in Vienna. He had a legal education, and his father was among the top ranks of the Austro-Hungarian judiciary. He was actually the chief prosecutor of Graz, Austria, during the First World War. Preminger loved the atmosphere that you'll see in Laura. It's not exactly high society, but we rather term cafe society. This is very much the emerging world of letters, of intellectuals, of urban types who are aspirational in their tastes and seem like they're having a good time, but can actually be quite vicious people. You'll see iconic images of New York cafe society in the film. They hang out at the famous El Morocco Club, and there's a scene where they're going into El Mo, and there's some choice lines there that I won't spoil for you. When Laura first meets the Clifton Webb character, who becomes her mentor, and we can talk about what the relationship really is, she approaches him at the famous Algonquin Hotel. The Algonquin Hotel was a site, a place where a lot of the top wits would gather and have titanic lunches where they would throw around creative ideas and tease each other and generally make fun, right? So these locations you'll see within the film. There's also a lot of Upper East Side. The addresses aren't mentioned in the movie, but if you read the novel, if you take the trouble to read the novel, you'll find out that Laura lives on East 62nd Street in Manhattan. Her auntie lives on Fifth Avenue. These are very desirable addresses, although the Upper East Side's kind of gone lately. Nobody wants to live there anymore. You can go blocks and blocks without seeing people now. But at that time, it was really quite popular. Until quite recently, it was a popular place. So you'll see that world reflected in the film. The novel version of this, what happens with the screenplay, she decides to write it instead as a straight novel. She wrote it at a very interesting time in the history of the Second World War. It was written between June 1941, or just after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, when she started it, and she finished it up just after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed the American naval base in Hawaii and precipitated America's entry into World War II. It came out serially. We used to publish novels in serial format, sometimes in thick journals, as we used to call them, but also in Collier's magazine that published Laura serially. And then in 1943, it appeared as a novel in its own right. With Preminger's help, Caspary actually sold it to 20th Century Fox, one of the major movie studios in Hollywood, where the readers actually said, well, this is okay, but the script really needs to be drastically rewritten because the writing's actually very poor. This is an autodidact, a stenographer who tried to write a novel. We need to do something to punch this up. It went over to a creative team of writers supervised by Preminger. Preminger turned on Caspary and said that she couldn't participate in the rewriting. She didn't feel so great about that. They couldn't agree really on what the nature of the characterization was, and Preminger's own position on the film was tenuous. Otto Preminger, if you know anything about the man, had a ferocious temper, would scream at his actors, would scream at his boss, would do all kinds of crazy things. He had actually been fired by 20th Century Fox a few years earlier. Darryl Zanuck, who was the chief executive of the film studio, assigned him to be the director of the screen adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped. Zanuck himself had written the script of Kidnapped. So he thought Preminger had messed with the script, and Preminger denied it very angrily. They had a huge argument in Zanuck's office, which ended with Preminger storming out and slamming the door. It's not what you do to your boss, right? It's never a good idea. They fired him. They didn't even tell him he was fired. They just changed the locks on his door and took his name off. So how does he come back? During the war, Zanuck was actually drafted for military service. Even though he's the head of a big Hollywood studio, he has to do his part. He was commissioned as a colonel in the U.S. Army Signals Corps, assigned first to New York and then to London, where he was meant to study British wartime propaganda films. This is He also participated in a cross-channel raid on a German radar station because he wanted to see some action, so that they allowed him to do this. While he was away, the stand-in who was running 20th Century Fox hired Preminger back as a director because he didn't know about the dispute. So here's Preminger looking at this saying, okay, well, we're about to do Laura, so this is going to be great. And guess who comes back from his military service? Zanuck comes in, finds us like, okay, well, there's nothing I can do about this. A contract had been signed. He's supposed to work for them. He said, you can produce the picture, but you can't direct it. You're never going to direct at 20th Century Fox, Preminger, but we'll let you produce it since you're on contract and we have to employ you in some way. Says, all right, fine. Who's the director? Director's going to be Rouben Mamoulian. Rouben Mamoulian you might know from other movies. He had made some important ones in the 1930s. He was a much more accomplished director than Preminger, also equaled him in ego. They didn't get along well at all. Mamoulian's conception of the film was more like Kaspery's. It was more centered on Laura as a woman very much like Kasper herself, somebody who has to balance the challenges of being a female professional at that time with having a private life. Right? If Mamoulian had finished the film, it probably would have been something more like what we used to call a ladies' picture. You know what a ladies' picture is? It's a picture essentially about women, their problems and challenges. The great example from this period would be the Warner Brothers film from 1942, Now Voyager, right? It was starring Joan Crawford. It's about a woman who has a psychological crisis and she has to figure this. It's something that wouldn't interest men. Today we'd call it a chick flick. Crudely. I don't know, are we still allowed to say that? Well, this is Hungary. It's the land of free speech, we can say. In Brussels, they'd probably shut us down if we said. But this is Budapest. So what happens then is that Preminger contradicts Mamoulian on a lot of different things, and Mamoulian eventually is fired from the picture. It essentially ruined his career, too. He only made 2 movies after that, despite the fact that he lived for another 45 years. He was engaged to do a couple of other ones, including the screen version of Porgy and Bess, the Gershwin opera from the 1930s, but he was fired from that one too and replaced by Otto Preminger. So it actually happened twice that Preminger replaced Mamoulian as the director. Zanuck very reluctantly agrees, okay, fine, you can direct the movie. Nobody expected it to be a smash hit. In fact, the fee that was paid to Kaspery was quite low, and she never expected that anything would happen to it. Hollywood had a way of buying up story ideas. It still does today. Purchasing story ideas that look promising, and then for whatever reason, they're never produced. Not at all uncommon. If you think of what's the most famous American movie of the 1940s? Casablanca. Casablanca is also based on an unproduced play. The title of the play is Everyone Comes to Rick's. They purchased the rights to it, it's Warner Brothers, but nobody ever staged the play. They just used that as an adaptation for the film. Same thing with Laura. The cast were all relatively new to film. Jean Tierney, who you see in the picture here, she's Laura. She was 23 years old when she made the movie. Remember that as you watch her acting. And also when you listen to her voice. Originally, she had a very high-pitched, squeaky voice, and she didn't think that would make her a good actress. So somebody gave her a pack of cigarettes. Said, light up, Jean, this will solve your problem. She became heavily addicted to tobacco, smoked her entire life, and died of emphysema at the age of 70. Well, she had a good run, but this is what happens. But it did have the effect of lowering her range so that she's acting better. So we have her in the picture. She was relatively unknown at the time. Dana Andrews, who plays the big police detective, he's in the film. He was more or less a Western actor. He'd played like sheriffs and outlaws. Again, not super well known. Clifton Webb, who was an older actor who plays Waldo Lydecker. We can argue about his role. Again, in the picture, we'll talk about that more later. Clifton Webb had been a Broadway song and dance man. He had only ever made silent movies that were unknown, and I think almost all of them are now lost. I don't think there's any or very few silent films with Clifton Webb that you can see. And he had made a couple of spoken short pictures. So when you see him, you should constantly bear in mind that he was, at this point, well into his 50s, but this was his first serious role in film. Right? And originally, the Zanuck didn't want him. He thought that it wasn't right. They wanted to cast Laird Krieger, if you know the name. Laird Krieger, however, had just played Jack the Ripper in another movie, and it was thought that if you put him in, you might immediately guess he's a bad guy. Whereas with Waldo, it's kept ambiguous until the end of the movie. Again, trying not to give away the plot for those who haven't seen it. There is quite an incredible twist in the middle that makes it a very distinctive film. So I think that's all I want to say about it for right now. It did become a hit. I'll add a couple of things, though. It has a distinctive score. That's one of the most iconic Hollywood scores. It's an orchestral piece by Daniel Raksin. Daniel Raksin is regarded as the godfather of Hollywood film scores. This is his most famous one. He wrote over 100 film scores and also worked extensively in television, I think 300 television film scores. Why is this the most famous one? It was made under duress. It was one of these great Hollywood accidents. Preminger wanted to use Sophisticated Lady by Duke Ellington. You're laughing, Melissa. Of course it would be terrible. And we can talk about why he wanted to use Sophisticated Lady if you know what the song's really about. Is it about a sophisticated lady as you would understand? No. We'll talk about it after the movie. But Raksin said, what you say? It was not going to work at all. Raksin had been hired to do incidental music. He said, this is terrible. And Preminger just looked at him and said, well, you think you know better than me? You have a weekend to compose something else. So Raksin was like, what am I going to do? So he went home Friday night, starts to try to write something. Nothing comes out. Saturday morning, nothing comes out. He gets a letter from his girlfriend. I'm leaving you and I'll never see you again. The theme of Laura came right out of his pen. He wrote it right there. It was no problem at all. He had it done by Sunday. He put the letter on his piano and he was like, I need to be in a melodramatic mood, and wrote this iconic film score that you'll may immediately recognize. It was, again, written for movies, so it didn't have lyrics, but it was so good that the following year, in 1945, they gave it to Johnny Mercer with an assignment, one of the big record studios. It said, Mercer, we need lyrics for this. Want to hear them? Laura is the face in the misty night, footsteps that you hear down the hall, the love that floats on a summer night that you can never quite recall. And you see Laura on a train that is passing through, those eyes, how familiar they seem. She gave your very first kiss to you, that Laura, but she's only a dream. Oh. Thank you. We can mention indulging my poor singing, but the melody itself is steeped in the kind of European romantic tradition. Most Hollywood scores of that era were written by people who had come to the United States, first from the Russian Revolution, and then later as refugees from Nazi Germany, whose musical training was steeped in the high German romantic tradition, mainly that came after Wagner. So you have these wonderful composers, including very serious composers, who, like Eric Korngold, who had written operas, who wrote opus works, but are nevertheless best known for their film scores. And Raxin is of that tradition. His father was a Russian immigrant who was an orchestra conductor, so that's where he got his training. Final thing I'll say, the other iconic thing about Laura, you'll see this right when the film starts, you get the music, and you will also see one of the most important visual images, her portrait. You'll see it also throughout the film. It's the most important decorative piece in her apartment. We see the inside of her apartment. She has a giant portrait of herself. Now, the meaning of that, of course, do you keep portraits of yourself in your house? No. Your family, your kids, not yourself. She does. And just as an interesting note, that they had, Mamoulian had his wife paint a picture. But when he was fired as director, Preminger took it down because it wasn't really interesting. They did a studio photograph of Tierney dressed as Laura. It's a very seductive picture. It's in an outfit that you don't see her wear in the film. And then they brushed up they expanded the photo to large size and then brushed it up with paint so that it looks on film like an oil portrait, but isn't really. So that's just a trick of the film. And these are the first two things. They're quite jarring. You see her, and then you hear the music start. All right? And every time you see her within the film, the melody works as a leitmotif, like it would in music of that, classical music of that era. So we'll come back and talk more about it after the end. Enjoy the film. It's not that long. And it's in black and white. My students used to complain about seeing black and white movies, but you know the reasons why. The real criminal of the film. How many of you guessed right away that Waldo was the murderer? A couple of you. All right, but it's left deliberately ambiguous because we have so many suspects. We have Waldo, we have Shelby Carpenter, and we have Laura herself. We even have Anne Treadwell, played by the great character actress Judith Anderson. If you remember Judith Anderson, she played Mrs. Danvers in Hitchcock's first American film, Rebecca, after Daphne du Maurier. So the big question of the movie, do Waldo and Laura have sex? Yeah. Signs point to no. What is Laura to him? He just said it. You're the best part of myself. What's the first scene of the movie? We're in Waldo's apartment. He's making McPherson wait to see him, and McPherson is looking at his collections of beautiful things. He collects beautiful things, and Laura's the best part of himself. She's part of his collection. There's a deleted scene that wasn't in this particular print of the film that we saw today. They're going into the famous El Morocco, and it's the flashback where he's showing her around New York and introducing her to important people who can help her career. And so she became as well known as Waldo Lydecker's carnation, he's always wearing a carnation, and walking stick. She's an accessory to him. She's a beautiful thing he collects, and his obsession derives from control. Whenever his control is threatened, what does he do? He acts out in ways that destroys the rival. The painter Jacobi, at first, he resents him for being obviously much more of a man. He tries to implicate Carpenter as the murderer and makes fun of him from being from Kentucky. Sharecroppers, no doubt, one of the best lines of the film. Right? And of course, he also tries to diss McPherson at the end, saying, "Oh, you'll have a disgustingly earthly relationship, and he's beneath you." He tries to dispose of anybody who might be able to take her away from him, even if it's not a sexual relationship. Clifton Webb was well known to be openly homosexual, right? And he's playing a character who probably also is. A lot of scholars of film look at the depictions of gay people in Hollywood, and before they tended to avoid it because gay people were seen as funny. With Waldo, they start to become dangerous. And that has tremendous consequences later in the Cold War, because if you were gay, for example, during the Red Scare, it was a sign that to them that you might also be a traitor. You might also be a deviant in crime, as well as in your sexuality. You might be subject to blackmail. So this trope, which really lasts up until the 1980s, starts largely with this film. You see that in Waldo's character. Now, as for Laura herself, is she really the star of the movie? She's certainly the star of the book. They invited Vera Caspary, the author of the original screenplay or play and novel, to come visit the set at 20th Century Fox. And she met with Preminger and watched what was happening, saw some of the scenes, saw some of the rushes, and was infuriated. She thought this was a complete distortion of what she had intended to be. She wanted Laura to be, yes, a murder mystery, but also a murder mystery that tells her larger theme, which is an independent woman making it in professional life, having to balance, again, her personal life, which, as you can see from Laura, is very involved, with her professional life, and try to make sure that she is emerging in the best and truest possible way to herself. Is that what that film's about? Not at all. She sees what Preminger does with it, and suddenly Laura is reduced to this woman who can't really make her own choices. She's very easily manipulated. And as McPherson says, a great line that's not in the book, for a charming, intelligent girl, you sure surrounded yourself with a collection of dopes. Look at her suitors. We have a gigolo who's also dating her aunt. Okay. You hang out with this man you're probably not physically involved with, who's collecting you and grooming you to feed his narcissistic needs. And then we have McPherson, who's a police detective who we can fairly say crosses a large number of professional lines. He has a consistent voice throughout the film. It's that very kind of hard-boiled detective, just the facts, ma'am, which is in itself important for a reason I'll discuss next. But what does he do with her? He's as manipulative as the others. Why does he ask her that question when she comes back to life? The last thing he says, I need to know, what did you decide to do with Shelby? Are you going to marry him? Is that germane to the investigation? He makes it sound like it is.
It could be, though. It could be.
Is it?
It could be because it would cast more suspicion on Lizzie Hunts as perhaps having more motive.
Yeah, but his body language when he hears.
When she says no, what happens to it? You see his face in profile. Sure. When he asks her, did you decide to marry Shelby Carpenter? And she says no. Right? It's plausible that it could be part of the investigation, but when she says no, we see him in profile, and suddenly there's this great relaxation of his facial muscles. Like, I'm so glad to hear that. And then, once more, I admit, one scene would not convince you, maybe, or you wouldn't notice. It's a very subtle thing. When he identifies her as the murder suspect, brings her into the police station without booking her, without placing her under arrest, but putting her into, he says, I needed to do this in official surroundings. He wants to know why she changed her mind. He's much more interested in her personal decision about Shelby than he is in anything that would solve the actual crime. He wants to know what her intentions toward the other guy might be. And then what does he say? I was 99% sure of you. I needed the other 1%. And when she hears that, what's the look on her face? Pouting lips. She's quite happy that he took that trouble to find out. It's very flattering to her. So Caspary really did not care for the film. Now, why is the hero the detective? If you look at other film noir, particularly the earlier ones, start with the Maltese Falcon, the hero is never a police officer. The hero is a private detective. For some reason, they also focused on insurance investigators. The hero of Double Indemnity, which we'll watch soon, I hope, is an insurance investigator, played by Edward G. Robinson. Normally, when we think of insurance investigators in our society, these are people who try to screw you out of your insurance settlement. They're not sympathetic at all. Yet here they have investigative powers, and they're often the people who solve the crime. Police were part of the establishment institutions that were not trusted. Like the Irish maid Bessie says, I was brought up to spit at the sight of them. Because cops are corrupt. Cops are bad. With the war, cops become good. McPherson's a good guy. You see hero police officers in films all the way up until probably the early 1970s. And if you know anything about the New York City Police Department in the 1970s, 75% of them of the narcotics squad was revealed to be taking bribes from drug kingpins. Right? If you remember another iconic film in American history, The Godfather, how are the police portrayed in The Godfather? They're in with the mafia, and one of them has to be killed, and the excuse for killing him is that he's a corrupt cop. Right? But for now, in this halcyon period of the Cold War, Second World War leading into the Cold War, you have fundamentally good cops who are the heroes, both on the big screen and in television. It wasn't really the end for the film. Zanuck also didn't like it. He didn't like Preminger's ending, which is different. In the book, Waldo commits his murder with a gun that's concealed in his walking stick. If it's, as we say, a psycho thriller, this is how Caspari's work was described. What is the psychological significance of a gun concealed in your walking stick? The instrument of his murder, the instrument of his crime, is also a symbol of his impotence. Where do we get a hint of his impotence? Waldo's impotence in the film. Again, go back to that first scene. You hear the sound of him getting out of the bathtub and the water splashing. Hand me my robe, please. McPherson gives him his robe. And as he gets out of the bath, you hear the splashing, and McPherson looks at him and it's like this. Noticing the obvious small size of Waldo's penis. And you can't say it, you can't show it, but you can indicate that he's seeing it, and he's terribly unimpressed. Yeah. So Waldo has sexual impotence, which is meant to be implied by this. Caspary thought this was a great mistake. Why did you replace it with a shotgun? And Preminger, again, who was a trained attorney, thought to himself, well, that doesn't really make sense. Why would he walk around town with a murder weapon? Easily traceable, easily detectable. And also, if you have a gun concealed in your walking stick, is it going to be powerful enough to blow off a woman's face the way a double-barreled shotgun blast blows off the unfortunate Diane Redfern's face? No, so it doesn't make sense to the film. The clock bit is a contrivance that Preminger put in. It becomes a plot point. It becomes a narrative device. It's not really the same psychological impact that Caspary wanted to have. She never really got over it. She lived until 1987, and as late as the 1970s, when she was interviewed about her career, she was very angry about what Preminger had done to her book. And ironically, it's the only thing she's famous for. There's literally no other reason you should know about Vera Caspary other than that she was the author of Laura and that her work was made into this great film. Zanuck also didn't really like it, as I was saying. He thought that the ending should have been rewritten. But Zanuck, for all of his tempers and all of his kind of anger at his subordinates, actually could be reasoned with if he had sufficient evidence. So to convince him, they brought in Walter Winchell, who was probably the most famous journalist in America at that time, as a one-man screen test audience for the film. Walter Winchell sits down, watches Laura in the final cut, gets up at the end and goes up to Zanuck and says, "This is brilliant! This is a fantastic film! It's wonderful! Congratulations, Zanuck! You have a big success!" At which point Zanuck looks at Preminger and goes, "You were right. I concede." It was a smash hit. It made stars out of all the major characters, including Vincent Price. You probably haven't seen Vincent Price in a role like that before. Earlier in life, he was a character actor. Later on, he became famous as the villain in horror movies.
Poe stories, based on Poe stories.
Yeah, he did a lot of Edgar Allan Poe. He's in the Fall of the House of Usher. He's the last descendant of the decaying family. He tells Mr. Winthrop to leave this house. It's cursed. He played in a lot of ones that were frankly just bad movies but were horror films, but he got typecast in those roles, and that's what he's really most famous for. Here he's a matinee idol playing a gigolo who goes out with Laura's aunt. And that was actually Casperi's point. She asked Preminger, and said, why have you weakened Laura as a character? And Preminger just looked at her and said, she has no character. She has no sex appeal. She's a non-entity. And Casperi didn't have any. She was completely at a loss for words. She just went like, and it's like, really? You think that? Why do you think she's so great? She has to keep a gigolo and a guy who goes out with her aunt and this like weird obsessive older gay guy around. What possible independence does that suggest to you? It makes no logical sense. Again, using his legal training, it just didn't make any sense that it would be that way. And all Vera Casperi could say back to this was, well, Mr. Preminger, maybe you just don't understand love. And she stormed off the set. After the film succeeded, they ran into each other at the Stork Club, one of the great Manhattan Cafe Society places. They just happened to be in the same place at the same time. And she walked up to him and started an argument and said, I really don't like it. I have to tell you, I saw the final film. I really don't like it. I don't care if it's a success. And then he started like arguing back, and it got to the point where people thought it would get physical. So Sherman Billingsley, who was the owner of the Stork Club, actually had to come up and separate them. And at that point, Preminger realized things were getting out of control. So being a very correct Central European, he did this proper like Austrian bow and withdrew. And that was the last time they ever saw each other. But she remained quite angry about the adaptation of the film for the rest of her life.
Is that part of the reason why no one would work with her again? I mean,
Well,
like she had a perfect opportunity to use that as a springboard to say, oh, I've got another great story.
in a normal case, Melissa, I think you would be right. Her subsequent works are forgotten. She ended up living in the UK because she had been involved with communist organizations. She had joined the party under an assumed name. So she was never blacklisted. She was what we say graylisted, and ended up living abroad a bit of the time. Her personal life was a disaster. She got involved with a married guy who was then promptly drafted into the British Army in the war, so didn't see him for a long time. Ended up out of the country. In late life, she gave script writing workshops for female prisoners as a kind of good deed to do. But nothing that she ever wrote was ever again adapted for film. And I don't think it was because of her relationship with Preminger. Lots of people did not get along with Otto Preminger, including Zanuck, who had already fired him once. The cast's reaction to him as the replacement director was actually not very good. When Mamoulian left, out of spite, he went to all the actors and said, Preminger, as the producer, doesn't like your work. Which wasn't true, but it poisoned their attitude toward Preminger. And they got it done anyway. These were highly professional people. Jean Tierney's description of him later in her memoirs was that he was like a Prussian fencing master. He could both charm and intimidate you at the same time. And Preminger himself, if you know, he had started professional life as an actor with Max Reinhardt's theater in Vienna. He later did play in movies. His most famous role was the prison commandant in Stalag 17, made in 1953. And it's essentially his personality, this kind of very arch, very biting, wit. And then he went on television to play Mr. Freeze on the old Batman show. Again, entertaining to watch because you're essentially watching Otto Preminger match wits with Adam West as Batman. But that's the nature of the movie. I think we have a few more things we could bring up. Again, the Mercer tune became, I should have mentioned before, very popular. It was recorded more than 400 times. Nobody's asked me to record it yet, but 401 could be coming up. He also was recorded in 5 separate versions in 1945, all of which were on the top 10 popular song list that year. And then another version in 1946 was number 1 on the charts for 14 weeks. So that this movie suffused American culture and the artifact of the song and its lyrics would last for a very long time. And when the French directors saw it, they thought, oh yes, this is lived experience, because you're dealing with all these different subjectivities in the film, and we to a degree identify and sympathize, or at least understand every character going through it. These are very, very, very real people, and I think the reason for that is because they are so deeply flawed, because they make bad choices. What should Laura do in a modern context with all of these guys? She should run like hell. Right? You should just stare on people like that. You have pathological narcissist Waldo and.
Can I point out that Dana Andrews is very hot, so she should not run like hell.
Well, remember Waldo's line about him?
Yeah, Waldo was jealous.
In an earthy sort of way.
He was the best of the group by a long
That's a compliment.
Yeah. And also, when he talks about Jacoby, he's more conscious of being an athlete than an artist. So obviously, these are attractive men.
I rest my case. There you are.
Well, all right, but still, a policeman who crosses those professional lines, and when you're dead, hangs out in your apartment and falls asleep in your chair while staring at your portrait, and then bids on it in the auction. Yeah. You're entitled to overlook it, and she clearly ends up with him in the end. So she did. But and again, certainly obsessive. I've never put a bid on a woman's portrait who was dead before.
He's not a police department type. He's a single person who just happens a few sightings. What you haven't said at all, which I think seems to me relevant or screams to me, is the Agatha Christie type. This is sort of closed box. You know, somebody's been killed at the beginning.
No.
There are a certain number of suspects. Highly improbable false trails are laid everywhere, and then it comes through at the end. He's acting like a Michael Innes, Appleby, or something like that.
It's an important,
Actually, he's
yeah.
a policeman, but he's not.
It's an important distinction, because investigators before the detective genre of literature, they're all like Sherlock Holmes. And one of the ways that they were described as brilliant machines who are programmed to use logic and reason to solve crimes. So everything has an explanation, and in the end, it's all elementary, Watson. Right. But here, it's a different kind of detective. It's a subjective person who's actually part of the story.
It's quite 30s.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
All the Victor Golan's Yellowbacks.
It is a noir feature, right? Because they adapt that. It's like you're in the story. It's what we used to train journalists to do. We used to tell journalists, do not be part of the story. Now we train them to do the absolute opposite. We train them to be part of the story. And even the idea that they're there to explore truth or to determine what is factual is now on the outs in the journalism profession. You're there to determine what's right and what seems morally correct to you. Right. So
You mentioned something in the very beginning, and it's the very beginning of the movie, and I'm a long-time Gene Tierney fan. I've seen all the
I know that about you.
Oh, yeah. With the portrait. And I submit the portrait is a big star in the movie as well. But if you look at her later movies, and as unexpected as it is, she does this movie. It's a comedy with Danny Kaye on the Riviera.
Right.
And it's color. It's the first time I've ever seen her in color, 51. I actually had to check out the year because I didn't remember. But in that movie, that portrait is on the wall. Go see on the Riviera and that portrait.
It's actually,
Longer, but I don't remember in his exact. But if it's not exactly the same portrait because it's in color, and this one obviously isn't. It's so close that you kind of go, wait, I saw that more.
the irony here.
I challenge you. If you don't know, let me know. I mean, is that right?
I'll have to look again. I haven't seen the movie in a long time. But I'll look at
Does
this.
anyone know that's seen it?
Was in the portrait that you're referring to, is the other person holding a handkerchief?
In the portrait?
Yeah, but you're saying, I mean, in the one in the movie, the character's holding the handkerchief.
in the one on the Riviera, it looked, as I recall, it's exactly the same portrait.
Holding the handkerchief.
The handkerchief, I don't remember.
Okay.
I mean,
I just thought that was a very sort of stylized.
You must have recycled it. Well, it was in color anyway.
I would love to find out what happened to it, like in posterity. Like, where is that portrait now? I don't know the answer to that question, but I should find out.
wow, they're really bringing it back.
So, yes, John. I have a comment on that, but we'll go to John first.
Well, Paul, I just wanted to say, since I think Clifton Webb is the star of the movie, I wanted to know, can you tell us what impact the film had on the rest of his career? And in particular, he turned the Waldo Lydecker character into the comic character,
Yeah.
sitting pretty and so on.
So, actually, just to talk to Michelle first, the idea of the portrait, ironically, was something Gene Tierney hated. Because, and remember, this is a Hollywood actress we're talking about. You see the portrait first and not me. She was actually quite unenthusiastic about the film. It was like, she'd been in a couple of movies, and this is what makes her a big star. But she didn't expect it. She's like, who wants to play second fiddle to a portrait? So she didn't think it would work out in this way. Oh, it's like for half the movie or a third of the movie, you're seeing the portrait and not the actual woman. And the star wants to be out there for the audience, right? It's like if you had my voice on a cardboard cutout of me, I probably wouldn't be that happy about it. What is this for Clifton Webb? The character of Waldo is rather different from the book. In the book, he is as obsessive as the Waldo we see, but he's physically quite different. Clifton Webb is sort of short and very slender. In the book, he's described as 6'3" and significantly overweight, even obese, but still with the same obsessive tendencies and the same obsessions. So we actually use a different character here. And Zanuck, again, this is one of those pet peeves he had with Preminger, was that he didn't want Clifton Webb to be cast. He just didn't think it was the right thing. Preminger's argument was, you won't know he's the murderer right away. If you put Laird Krieger, the original choice, who had just played Jack the Ripper, you immediately know who the murderer is. So we have to avoid that.
Doesn't the name Linebacker suggest something sinister about his character?
Sure, he lies, You could look into the symbolism of that. I think that's probably right. What does it do with his career? The character itself, again, comes out of a comedy. Because a year before, or 2 years before, in 1942, one of the best Christmas movies that Hollywood ever put out, Warner Brothers put it out, was The Man Who Came to Dinner. Which starred Monty Woolley as Sheridan Whiteside, and Sheridan Whiteside is a brilliant columnist and critic, just like Waldo Lydecker. He's based on the real-life Alexander Wolcott, who was an Algonquin wit, where we see Waldo having lunch. He was part of the Algonquin Circle with Dorothy Parker and Harpo Marx. And we always understand Harpo to be the silent one, but in fact he was quite verbal and quite witty in real life. But Wolcott was an Algonquin wit. We see Waldo having lunch there. Zanuck actually gave that instruction. It's like, I want him to be like The Man Who Came to Dinner. And if you don't know the film, we have this very dazzling urban personality, pathological narcissist, also has an obsessive relationship with his secretary, who's played by Joan Crawford, and he's on a lecture tour in the Midwest, which he hates doing, but he makes a lot of money doing it. So this is why he's there. He's in some deserted place in Ohio, a town that doesn't even really exist on the map, and while he's there, he's meant to give a lecture a couple of weeks before Christmas. It's cold, it's snowy, there's ice. He slips down his host's steps, and he is forced to stay there with a broken leg, and it becomes an impossible person to have in your house, but it's hilarious. It's a really funny movie. So they wanted Waldo to mimic that as much as they possibly could. So what happens to his career? He becomes a major film actor, and he lived until the 1960s, I believe, or 70s, and he played in Cheaper by the Dozen, a man who's the father of 12 children, if you can imagine. He played the original screen version of Mr. Belvedere, which was later a sitcom in the 1980s. And these are very funny movies because he uses that wit that you see. It's very devastating to the poor characters in Laura, and of course he's a murderer, but he just does it to be funny. So his career actually takes off, just like all of the other ones did. And Dana Andrews as well, they became a major Hollywood star. Also, the ensemble acting is important. Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews made 5 more movies, a total of 5 movies together. And she also made 5 movies totally with Vincent Price. So it launched not just their careers, but also their synergies and their collaborations. Sure.
Info about the portrait. It said it was owned by Robert Osborne and hung in his New York apartment. But I can't find out what happened after he died to the portrait.
I am not surprised. I knew Bob, actually. He had 3 apartments. One was his residence, and he used the other 2 for Hollywood memorabilia. And they were in a building on West 57th Street called the Osborne. Still there. And funny story, he was a member of the New York Athletic Club, which is my club in New York. And in the book, that's never mentioned in the movie, McPherson lives at the Athletic Club. And to give you this idea of obsession further, in the book it's actually drawn out more. He's described as going to sleep in his room at the Athletic Club and having a 2-hour dream all about Laura, in which he sees the events of this plot up until that time 5 times in rapid succession, thinking about her and the idea of her settling in. And then just as in the movie, he goes to her apartment, falls asleep in her chair after drinking her bourbon. And there she is all of a sudden. Right? And when he finds out she's decided not to marry the terrible Shelby Carpenter, he has relaxation. He's like, oh, okay. I feel a lot better now. Happy to know that. Anyhow, that's all I've got. So if you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. But otherwise, until next time.